Well, until about 4 years ago, safeguarding, adult protection, as it was called then, was not on a statutory footing. And that all changed with the introduction of the Care Act 2014. And that was implemented in relation to safeguarding from the 1st of April 2015. And what that did was create a definition of the circumstances in which a local authority, as the lead agency for safeguarding, would be obliged to carry out an investigation. And it is as follows. First of all, the local authority has to have reasonable cause to suspect that a person receiving care and support in their locality is either experiencing abuse or neglect, or is at risk of that occurring. And then finally, that individual, because of their needs, cannot protect themselves. Now, if those three elements are actually made out, then there's an obligation for the local authority to carry out an investigation. And I think the important thing to convey there is that it's dealing with a named individual or named individuals within a care service, and those matters are current concerns that require investigation to ensure that that person is properly safeguarded, protected, so far as is necessary within the particular service in question. Safeguarding is an important jurisdiction. It's a public function of local authorities, and it can have incredible consequences for providers. It can lead to contract suspensions. In extreme situations, it can lead to termination of contracts. It can also lead on to CQC investigations themselves in relation to the service and enforcement action. But equally, the matter might be referred to the police, and it could lead to criminal prosecution in some situations. And not only just are we talking about named individuals, there's this wider remit in terms of safeguarding, sometimes somewhat ill-defined, where local authorities will say, well, actually, what we're doing now, because we've got some concerns about a number of individuals within a service, we're going to do a whole service inquiry to look to see whether there's organisational or systemic abuse, institutional abuse sometimes it's called, within a service. And examples of that would have been Winterbourne View several years ago, and more recently Walton Hall, which was on the BBC. So what I say to my clients is that you need to be participants, not spectators. You need to take a proactive approach so far as is possible. Now, the only qualification to that is if there's a police-led inquiry, because then you have to respect that investigation and you have to wait for the outcome of that investigation. And sometimes that can take some considerable time. But if it is a local authority-led investigation, then there's no reason why the provider should not be a active participant within that sort of process. And indeed, there may be some investigations where the local authority says, provider, you investigate it. Obviously there's an issue, but we think that you can deal with it. If it's more serious, then you'd expect the local authority to actually investigate it themselves. Now, I've got some concerns about safeguarding. First of all, it can be an ill-defined process. So you have situations where sometimes things that are quality issues that really should be dealt with under contract management become elevated to safeguarding issues. So I think that's an issue in itself. There's also a concern that I've got that sometimes it isn't very well defined by the investigative body, the local authority, so they don't actually sort of clearly identify what the allegations are, what the issues are, and they don't share the evidence that they've got. And equally, some of these investigations can drift. So although there's a timescale, an indicative timescale, very often they don't meet those timescales, and it can go on for some considerable time. And as it goes on, new matters can be introduced. So you have a situation sometimes where it can go on for many, many months. And one of the advantages, I think, of actually having a lawyer on board is that it adds a little bit of rigour to the process, and I can actually hold the local authority to account to ensure that they actually do follow their own local safeguarding procedures, because it's important that things are actually investigated in an effective and timely fashion. So what's the important tips really for providers? Well, I think first of all, as I've said, to be active participants so far as possible. You may also, as a provider, need to respond to allegations. If you can carry out an investigation, if you do have evidence available to you, you may need to suspend staff or even terminate the employment of certain staff members. you may need to consider referring individuals to the disclosure and barring service for investigation if somebody has been harmed or has been at risk of harm. So those are considerations as well. Equally, sometimes with a safeguarding investigation, you may reach the conclusion that you can't actually look after the named individual. Their needs may be so serious that you actually can't look after them. You may be a residential care home that doesn't offer a nursing service, and perhaps an individual requires very intense nursing care because their needs have changed. So it may be that you might need to sort of terminate the contract and have somebody sort of moved on to more suitable accommodation. So all these issues I think are important. And then of course I've alluded to the fact that there will be the procedure, the safeguarding procedure. And you need to look at that because I think it's important that if there is an inquiry that generates an investigation report, that you see it in good time, because you will want to be able to respond to that in accordance with principles of natural justice. You have a right to respond to it, and it may be that you do accept the outcome, or there could be findings or facts that you do challenge, because the important thing is that the right decisions are made for the individuals concerned or the overall service, but equally that as a provider it's a fair outcome in terms of the actual issues in question. Now obviously the primary concern are the individuals, the service users, but equally providers do have rights within this process. And I think that if you are finding that you're not being treated fairly, you're not being given information, you're not being given timescales, allegations are being made as though they were findings really, that you ought to consider obtaining legal advice to ensure that your position within this process can be properly reflected and defended.